This is the place for history on the KY3 Digital Desk, except today we are not at the desk. We're in Independence, Missouri, outside the Truman Library and Museum. Let's go inside and meet some of the people. So we're here with Kurt Graham, the director of the Truman Library and Museum, and we're talking about the 1948 election, and behind you is probably the most famous picture from that election. Take us back to that time. I thought Truman was popular.
Well, the election of 1948 is really one of the great electoral moments in our history. It represents a kind of watershed, a major change in the way elections were done. Prior to that time, candidates stood for office. They didn't overtly run for office. It was seen as a little unseemly to go out and actually ask people for votes. You sent the surrogates out to say, this is a great guy, wouldn't he? We ought to keep him in office, we ought to do this. And Truman changed that by taking his message directly to the people. And he crisscrosses the country twice on the back of a train in 2.5 months. Now that's when elections lasted 2.5 months and not 2.5 years like they do today. But it was a very compressed period of time for him to hit all those states and really take his message to the people directly. And I think, it's very clear that made all the difference.
What role did the economy play at that time in the election?
Well, I mean, there were issues with the economy, and everybody thought, I guess, that the rural vote, or what they called the country vote, would not necessarily break for Truman in the way that it did. But what they forget is Truman was a farmer. And so he's this Missouri farmer who's going around the country and stopping in these rural areas, these whistle stops, these little towns, and saying to them, look, I feel your pain, I get this. And he was very successful in blaming the Congress. This do-nothing 80th Congress. They cracked down on labor prices. They're not doing what they need to do for the people to be able to get a stronger economy or a better share of the deal. And so Truman really explains that in a way that resonates with ordinary people. And so they break for him very heavily when the voting comes in.
And we hear that phrase, do nothing Congress, to this day.
Yeah. It just seems to get truer by the year.
Yeah. So what role did civil rights play in this election? Did that really hurt him?
Well, it's interesting. There's a really important context for the election of 1948, and that is that Truman makes two very fundamental, potentially very controversial decisions in the run-up to the election. Now, he recognizes the state of Israel when it's declared in May of 1948, and he desegregates the armed forces and the federal workforce in July of 48. Now, this is when he has to stand for election. In September, October is when he's out doing the whistle stop tour, and of course the election is in November. But this is going to be fresh on people's minds, and so there's no question that Truman took a risk, took a chance with these two big decisions, because this is 1948, and yes, a lot of people then, as now, say, well, he was pandering for Jewish votes, he was pandering for black votes. And he was a politician. He certainly understood these voting blocks to be important. But this is not exactly the zenith of American pluralism in 1948. I mean, he alienated as many people as he drew to him. But the story of the civil rights, I mean, he ends up being the first president to address the NAACP, which he did on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And he said, I will make the federal government the vigilant defender of the rights of all Americans. And then he paused dramatically and he said, when I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. And they knew exactly what he meant. And so it became, the blinding of Isaac Woodard, some of these other things that happened when a sergeant returning from the war, an African-American sergeant in his uniform, dragged from a bus and beaten so severely that he permanently lost his sight. That was, for Truman, that was enough.
We've heard a lot about, of course, in history class, Lincoln-Douglas debates. There were debates in this election. What was the impact of those debates, if anything at all?
Well, I don't know that this, debates don't really become a big deal in elections the way, and I'm not even sure they're a big deal now, honestly, in terms of whether they change anybody's mind. I think the real televised debate, with Nixon and Kennedy, that's really the beginning of the modern presidential debate cycle and process, and the sort of the sort of horse race that we sort of set up and look at that way. Truman and Dewey just waged fundamentally different kinds of campaigns. Dewey was a very cautious, kind of buttoned down. I mean, he was the irony is Dewey probably would have been a very good president. He was a prosecutor. He'd made a name for himself fighting crime, busting, mob bosses and that kind of thing. The corrupt, kind of mafia influence, and he was, he was a Hollywood handsome kind of guy, looked a lot like Clark Gable. I mean, he had everything going for him, and he was well-spoken and well-heeled and all of that. But he played it very safe. He played a very staid campaign. He just stood for unity, and it wasn't vicious in the way that it is now, because Truman really didn't even run against Dewey. He ran against the Congress more than anything. That's what worked Truman up more than anything. It wasn't Dewey. And so, everybody just assumed that Dewey would win. I mean, it was a year when things were kind of breaking that direction, economic issues, other things, making it clear that Truman was going to have to struggle to overcome that. But he did, and he did it in a pretty big way. It was ended up not being a particularly close election.
You mentioned heading out across the country as one of the ways of direct campaigning that still has an impact to this day. Are there other things that happened during that campaign that we may see this year passed down directly?
Well, one of the things that happens in presidential elections now is, of course, now it's not a train. Presidents fly in and get out, and the press gets out from the back of the plane and comes around and takes a picture, and he makes some speech about that community, and then gets back in the plane and flies to the next town. So, they're just trying to make that news cycle, that they visited such and such a town, they touched down, they got the key to the city from the mayor or whatever happens. So a lot of that happens, but I think what's interesting about 48 is the way Truman was able to kind of personalize his message for each of the towns that he stopped in. So he had a stump speech. I mean, he had kind of the standard lines that he repeated over and over and over again. And of course, there's no YouTube or anything, so that it wasn't being repeated before he got there. I mean, it was new to that audience when he shared it. But it was also, he would say something unique about that community, about their congressman, or about the governor or the mayor, or the factory in town, and how he was trying to fight for this or fight for that. I mean, he had a very specific message always, tailored for the community that he was in. And I think that's something that we see even still in our presidential politics, taking a national message and taking it down to the local level.
And it seems like a good time, Kurt, to wrap this up. I thank you for joining us to talk about the election.
Thank you very much.
This is The Place for History on the KY3 Digital Desk.